Hello, everybody. I hope you are doing well. Welcome to a long-awaited show. It has been a wee while since we have last done a live stream, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing tonight's topic with you. We're going to be looking at sacred fire, the gift of Prometheus, which he stole from Zeus and the gods and gave to mankind. And we're going to be discussing a little bit about the significance of the sacred fire, both for the ancient Greeks in various different ways, and from there, how it might have some impact or significance for us too. And I mean, there's so many angles we could go with this. There's so many different routes to explore that no doubt I'll miss some in the process of this talk. So please do put your own ideas and comments in the chat, and I'll be engaging with those after the kind of main presentation, and we'll develop the conversation from there. I think it's worth saying as well a little bit about the context of why I wanted to do this stream. As some of you will know, the Witten run by Shieldings is coming up in just over a week's time. Begins next Friday in an undisclosed location in the United Kingdom. And this is going to be a great, in a way, a celebration, but also meeting of many different people within our sphere or globule, as I discovered another word for sphere is our globule in the corner of the internet, this community that we're building and growing and is starting to have some impact through things like basket weaving. Well, this is a kind of annual get together, a meeting where various different people will speak to the theme of this year, a new order. What would a new order look like? How can we get there? And I have very fortunately have been asked or invited to be one of the speakers following a submission I made. And I've been doing quite a bit of research for this, and the first draft of the speech is now ready. And initially, I'd wanted to talk about Prometheus. I mean, you can't get much more of a story about a new order than the Promethean story in many ways, as we shall see. But as I was writing it, I came to realize I'm not going to have time to talk about Prometheus. I'm not going to have time to go into esoteric, deep discussion of ancient myths when I'm addressing these fine men and women at the Witten. So I thought maybe this would be a good place to discuss some of those things, and maybe a little kind of precursor to, or a trailer for what I might be discussing in a week's time. That said, I think there are still tickets available. So if you want to come to the Witten and hear not just myself, but people like Carl Benjamin, Academic Agent, Alex Masters, the Steam guy, will be speaking. There are plenty of others. Then, Professor Ed Dutton, Apostolic Majesty. Then you still have time. Go and get one. And it's not just for the speeches. I think that's an important thing to say as well. A lot of the experience is sitting down at dinner or having a beer with people that you've spoken to online for many years, and then finally get to do it face to face, or even people you've never met before, talking to them, discussing the things we like to discuss, being in a room with people that you don't have to explain everything or be on your guard constantly. You know they get it. And that's a really wonderful experience. It feels like you've been friends for a long time with some of these people. So that is just as much worth it as the talks. While we're letting people trickle in, let me say hello to those of you who are watching. Hello to David, Caravaggio, CM Piano 2, Will, Melon, and hopefully Vingle's still around. Hello to you all, and to those lurkers outside of the chat as well. You are most welcome. Before we get into it, I wanted to express my thanks as well. It's been a while, and I don't know if I've had a chance since King Arthur Day, but I wanted to thank everybody for their support during the day. It went really well. It kind of turned into a week, didn't it? There was so many wonderful contributions that I didn't want to cut it down. I thought, no, we can actually build this up into a kind of week climaxing with a couple of days of full schedules. And the range of topics, I thought we did justice to the length and breadth of the Arthurian tradition, both with the historical Arthur and the development of the literature, the artistic side, music. It was really great, and my hope is that in some ways we can build upon that it won't just lie as a single week sort of thing, but in the future maybe do things which are inspired by the Arthurian tradition. We can actually look at these videos and say, okay, this has given me inspiration to do X, Y, and Z, or I can use this as material for developing an event or something like that. And more broadly, for reconnecting us with our historic roots, mythological, historical, etc. I think Arthur, for me, touches on primordial things, deep kind of figures within my soul that I know connect me to my ancestors and the culture and tradition which I come from. It's like it awakens something below the modern self, the conscious self, and bursts forth in me. And I think it does that for many people, not just in this sphere, but in general. And it's about kind of tapping into that power, that authority, that sincere way of being. I really believe in that. So I want to thank you all for supporting that, because it wouldn't have worked if you guys hadn't watched it, promoted it. Some of you contributed, and I really want to invite you to kind of take that on forwards as well. And in some ways, I see the Greek mythology, which we're talking about today, in a similar light. In many ways, the ancient Greeks do stand at the foundational point of our civilization in Western Europe in general. It's not just the Greeks that this speaks to. If you even consider, for example, the Celtic peoples, the ancient Celtic peoples, we know for a fact that when Julius Caesar invades Gaul, the Gauls were claiming that they were descended from the Trojans. And they were saying, okay, this means that we are cousins with the Romans, because the Romans claim that they are descended from the Trojans as well. There is evidence using source criticism that tribes in Britain, in the south of Britain, believed that they were descended from Aeneas's descendants, so the refugees from Troy, i.e. Brutus of Troy. Now, they may not have known that individual as being called Brutus or Cornelius, but they certainly had a sense of, we are descended from these Trojans who fled from the siege of Troy when the Achaeans broke in and slaughtered the city with the Trojan horse. So there has been a long-standing idea within our cultures in the west of Europe, that and the far west of Europe, the northwest of Europe, that we too have a biological ethnic connection with the Grecian Hellenic part of the world, perhaps as their antagonists, right, at a certain point. But we are in some sense enabled to inherit their tradition, in a sense, through that connection. At least I think that's how they would have seen it. And mythologically, this breaks out in various ways. I'll just give you one example before we get to Prometheus. The story of Hercules was one of the major tales within the classical world. Hercules was a hero to many different people. He was the ideal, he was the apex of what a man should be, at least in the physical sense. He was able to dominate monsters with brute force. He wrestled the Nemean lion into submission, strangling the life out of it. The same with Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded Hades. He defeated with ingenuity the Lernaean Hydra, this beast with many heads, this serpent-like beast with many heads. And he achieved many other fantastic feats. And he was praised not only by the Greeks and the Romans, but many Germanic tribes counted Hercules as one of their heroes and indeed venerated him. There's evidence of this, and the depictions of Hercules can be found across the Roman Empire. He really was the kind of, I don't want to use the word superhero because I think that doesn't do justice to it, but he really was one of the most well-known characters in the world. And it seems to me that he's present in at least two major stories connected to Britain or England, right? And one of them is Beowulf. There is this Beowulf is a kind of Herculean character. He, like Hercules, is extremely strong, perhaps the strongest of men, and is able to take on various monsters that nobody else would. And one of the parallels we see is that when Hercules fights the Nemean lion, at first he tries to shoot it with arrows. This is something that Hercules does a lot of, using his bow and arrow to kill monsters. But the skin of the Nemean lion is so tough that no weapon could pierce it. And so Hercules is forced to strangle the life out of it with his bare arms. Well, Beowulf, when he fights Grendel, the man-eating troll, he decides beforehand that he was not going to fight him with weapons. Why? Because in his view, it would be an unfair fight. He would easily slay the troll, and thus to make it more equal, he would fight him fist to fist and let God decide the winner. But as it turned out, this was the right decision, because Grendel's skin was too tough for blade to pierce it, to penetrate deep within it. And so, and this gets displayed when some of his fellow warriors try to defend themselves and their swords just bounce off. Beowulf then manages, with severe strength, rip Grendel's arm clean off, and the beast wanders away, blood pouring from his side. He is mortally wounded. So we have two strong men who are able to overcome by pure brute force, with unarmed, a monstrous foe. The second connection is that we have in these characters, how to put it? Let me get the right information here, because I don't want to misspeak. I did a tweet about this a little while ago, where I wrote down the specifics. But it's to do with King Arthur and the nature of his conception, because it seems to parallel in certain ways the stories of Hercules. So let me get to the right information. And as many of you will know, Arthur was born out of wedlock. He was not, his father, Uther Pendragon, fell in love with the Duke of Cornwall's wife. And while the Duke of Cornwall was away, he'd been kind of lured off in some ways by Uther and was about to be assassinated. He convinced Merlin, that is, Uther convinced Merlin to transform him into his into the appearance of the Duke of Cornwall. And so when he arrived at the Duke of Cornwall's castle, the Duke of Cornwall's wife thought that this was her husband, and they had sexual relationships. They had sex. And this was how Arthur was conceived. Well, Zeus had fallen in love with a beautiful human woman. And while her husband was away, a general, I believe, he disguised himself. He transformed his appearance into that of the generals, and then, snuck into the house, conveyed that he was her husband, and then had sex with her. And this led to the conception of Hercules. And it's interesting that both of these individuals were conceived through a deceptive act. And what's interesting is that in a lot of mythology, individuals who are born through somewhat unnatural relationships, such as this, or perhaps an incestuous one, tend to be marked as special. The nature of their conception, because it's not the ordinary way, in some sense conveys the magnificence of he who is conceived. And we see this with incest in the respect to Siegmund and Sieglinde, who are identical twins. Oh, sorry, they are twins who were separated at birth, and then unknowingly at first fall in love, and they then give rise to Siegfried, who's the great hero who slays Fafnir and marries Brunhilde. And indeed, Siegfried himself comes in disguise later as Gunther to woo Brunhilde for Gunther. So there's this theme carried on again. But with Hercules and Arthur, we clearly see two magnificent men. One conquers beasts and monsters, the other, the great king of the golden age of Britain. Both of them are conceived through this lie, essentially, and it just parallels so nicely. So we can even see there that I think the stories of British heroes are in a way a reworking, or certain motifs are a reworking of some of the great tales from ancient Greece. So it permeates our own culture, the Greek tales and Greek philosophy. Never mind the influences on an intellectual level of Plato and Aristotle and so on. So with that said, I've been kind of talking about other related things, but let's get into the Promethean tale. And the story of Prometheus is first written by a poet named Hesiod. Now, Hesiod is, along with Homer, who was the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, one of the earliest and most important Greek poets. Both Hesiod and Homer really stand at the beginning of Greek poetry as we have it today, at least the written tradition. And everybody coming afterwards is in some way influenced or inspired or engaging with these two authors. They are, how would you say it? They are like the Shakespeare of their period, but at the very beginning, let's say. They're like the Bible, or the King James Bible for the English language. That's how significant they both are. And Hesiod writes two texts which deal with the Prometheus story in slightly different ways. There's a commonality between them, but they do have have different emphases or variations within the story. The first or main version is in the Theogony, which is a description of the mythic, a history of the mythic world, of the gods. How did we end up with Zeus being king of the gods? And listing all of the genealogies and interactions between these figures. And so he tells of how Uranus, who was the first king of the gods, was overthrown by his son Kronos, or Time. And in turn, Kronos was overturned or usurped by Zeus, his son. And it is within telling that tale, having told that tale, he then goes on to talk about um, uh, the tale of Prometheus. Now, we should say before we get into it that Prometheus was involved in the war between Zeus and Kronos. He belonged to the Titans, the Titans being those gods who were kind of in ascendancy during the reign of Kronos. But Prometheus sided with Zeus and the Olympians, who are the rest of kind of Zeus's court. And in so doing, he really helped Zeus to overthrow Kronos. So this was an important figure, but it's already shown that he's one that's willing to disobey or go his own way. He's not just going to follow the authority as it's already established. He has his own ideas, his own mind. And the instant really begins with a set of sacrifices. Men at this point, there are only men, there's only gods and mankind. Mankind has no needs. It gets everything it needs from the gods. And they are engaged in sacrifices to the gods. This is how they give thanks. This is part and parcel of a relationship between the gods and men. And they offer a sacrifice to Zeus. But Prometheus tries to play a trick on Zeus with this sacrifice. He separates out the fats and the bones, and he covers them in grease or fat. So the organs, and the bones, and he covers them in grease. And he tells Zeus to pick what he would choose as what's owed to him. And Zeus takes the organs and muscles, not realizing that the bones are also covered in grease. And so when these bones are then given to mankind, Zeus is outraged by this and believes he has been tricked. This seems to be seems to be the case that he wanted, or the bones are more valuable than the organs in this case. And so Zeus has been wronged in and somehow the greasing of the organs deceived Zeus in this respect. Hesiod also suggests that this practice of dedicating the bones is therefore carried on in Greek culture from that time onwards. So Prometheus plays this trick. And so Zeus's first response to this is to withdraw the sacred fire from mankind. Indeed, this is my copy of the Theogony, and there's a really good description of what the kind of fire was that I want to read in particular. So spoke Zeus in his wrath, whose designs do not fail. And after that, with his anger ever in mind, he would not give to the ash trees the power of untiring fire for mortal men who live on earth. I think that's a really important point that we'll see later in this video. It's not just any fire which Zeus withdraws from men. It is the sacred fire, the pure fire, the fire which is unending. All fires that we know have an end. They burn themselves out. Once they run out of fuel or oxygen or heat, they die. And that is true of any fire. Even stars, which are balls of flame, eventually die out. But not this fire. This fire which the gods have is an eternal, everlasting fire. And this is what Zeus took from mankind. So it wasn't just fire in general, although we might say that every fire is a derivative of this. This is the highest of fires. And Prometheus says no. And in secret, he steals the fire and returns it to men once more. So men have this gift of eternal fire. Now, Zeus is again outraged and angry at this situation. And so what does he do? Well, he punishes both men and Prometheus. With Prometheus, he binds him in fetters, which are cruel and strong and deeply painful. And every day, an eagle, which he has Hephaestus, the god of kind of engineering and metalwork and so on, form this metal eagle. So it's almost like a robot, you might say, an ancient robot that will come and feast on Prometheus's liver every day, because Prometheus is a god, his liver will grow back. So forever, this bird will feast on Prometheus's liver. Absolutely brutal torment, right? The for mankind, well, I shall read you what Hesiod says, because it's quite a punchy passage. When he had made the petty bane to set against at once he made an affliction for mankind to set against the fire. The renowned ambidexter moulded from the earth the likeness of a modest maiden by Cronos' son's design. The pale-eyed goddess Athene dressed and adorned her in a gleaming white garment. Down over her head she drew an embroidered veil, a wonder to behold, and about her head she placed a golden diadem, which the renowned ambidexter made with his own hands to please Zeus the father. On it were many designs fashioned, a wonder to behold, all the formidable creatures that the land and sea foster. Many of them he put in, charm breathing over them all, wonderful designs, like living creatures with a voice of their own. When he had made the pretty bane to set against the blessing, he led her out where the other gods and men were, resplendent in the finery of the pale-eyed one whose father is stern. Both immortal gods and mortal men were seized with wonder when they saw that the precipitous trap, more than mankind can manage. For from her is descended the female sex, a great affliction to mortals as they dwell with their husbands, no fit partners for accursed poverty, but only for plenty. As the bees in their sheltered nests feed the drones, those conspirators in badness, and while they busy themselves all day and every day till sundown making the white honeycomb, the drones stay inside in the sheltered cells and pile the toil of others into their own bellies. Even so, as a bane for mortal men, has high thundering Zeus created women, conspirators in causing difficulty. And he gave a second bane to set against a blessing for the man who, to avoid marriage and the trouble women cause, chooses not to wed, and arrives at grim old age lacking anyone to look after him. He is not short of livelihood while he lives, but when he dies, distant relatives share out his living. Then again, the man who does partake of marriage and gets a good wife who is sound and sensible, spends his life with bad competing constantly against good, while the man who gets the awful kind lives with unrelenting pain in heart and spirit, and it is an ill without a cure. So Hesiod has a pretty savage view of the role of women in life, that in many ways they are a curse to be with and a curse to be without, and that Zeus punished mankind for having the gift of eternal fire by giving them this desire for women, and also by giving them women. In particular, I think he's zeroing in on this idea that men do most of the hard labor in the fields, toiling away, and the woman benefits from that without giving anything in return. More than that, causing hassle and heartache. And Hesiod himself, it seems, was a shepherd. He had farming experience. So one might be able to understand that this was something he had experienced himself in his own family. But nonetheless, this is his first rendering of it, that the curse of Zeus is the gift of woman, which I'm sure incels and manosphere bros will be delighted to repeat forevermore. I can see somebody like Bap rejoicing in this version of the Promethean story. I'd be surprised if he hasn't done a podcast on it at some point. So that's the first telling of the Prometheus tale. The second is also by Hesiod, and I should have said he's writing in the 700 BC, around that time, 700 BC, a bit earlier perhaps. And it's in another kind of work, which is in many ways quite different from the Theogony. It's Works and Days. And this is more like a manual for life and for understanding how to live your life as somebody who toils in the fields, as a farmer, or a seafarer, perhaps, as well. And in this one, he's trying to really explain the nature of labor and why labor is important, why it is that some kinds of strife or hardship are good for human beings. And this is where this version of the Prometheus tale takes place. Let me read to you a little bit. So I see that one kind of strife was elder born of gloomy night, and the son of Kronos, the high-seated one who dwells in heaven, that is Zeus, set her in the earth's roots, much for the better for men. The earth's roots, the soil, right? He's put it there. He's made it a struggle to produce food for a good reason. This she rouses even the shiftless one to work. So the necessity to produce food forces even the lazy person to try and work, because if they don't work, they die. Remember, there's no welfare state here, right? There's no government that's going to provide for you if you're unfit to work or unable or unwilling. This is you have to work or you die. That is the situation at this period. For when someone whose work falls short looks towards another, towards a rich man who hastens to plough and plant and manage his household well, then neighbour vies with neighbour as he hastens to wealth. This strife is good for mortals. And that's a kind of interesting twist as well. It's not just the necessity of producing food to live, but it's actually envy here or jealousy which drives people further. Oh, that guy's got a nice house. I want a nice house too. Oh, my neighbor's got a new car. I want to have that new car too. Oh, my neighbor's cut his lawn. I better go and cut my lawn too, because I don't want to look worse than him. In fact, I want my lawn to look better than his. It may not even be a kind of as an enemy. It's just a rivalry that we instinctively have, a desire to exceed others, and in many ways you could say market capitalism is a lot like this, especially a kind of free market utopia where individuals, using their own skills and resources and the talent pool they can draw on, their own ingenuity, compete with one another to maximize profits and so on. It seems like Hesiod is almost describing that kind of world. And then he goes on to kind of explain how this came about, how it is that we have to work hard to produce our food. And he says, so he says the following: for the gods keep men's food concealed, otherwise you would easily work even in a day enough to provide you for the whole year without working. Soon you would stow your rudder up in the smoke, and the business of oxen and toiling mules would disappear. So if we didn't have to work, we wouldn't. That's Hesiod's opinion. It's I think it's very true to reality as well that most of us, we work because we have to. If you remove the constraints, the necessities to work, the envy which drives us, or the motivations, then we would spend a life relaxing. And you see this with a lot of folks who have moved into retirement, right? Especially in the West. If somebody can afford to have a nice, comfortable life going on holidays and cruise ships and tours and so on, then they tend to do that rather than doing more work or uh, grafting for the community or something like that. But some people do. But my point is just that if you took like a sample of the population, you would find that more are going to go that direction than the voluntary or even employed work if they can avoid it. And that's true of younger generations as well. Now, why did he do this? Well, Hesiod tells us, Zeus concealed it because he was angry that Prometheus's crooked cunning had tricked him. And he had tricked him using to do with the sacrifice. He doesn't go into detail about the sacrifice here, he just references it. So he's assuming his audience would know the story from the Theogony, which perhaps implies as well that it wasn't a story that he had come up with. Perhaps he was the first to write it, or one of the first, but it was something which had been known before. He tells us that then Prometheus stole the fire and using a torch returned it to humanity. And so he ordered that a woman would be formed. And in much the same way that we find in the first tale, we have a woman formed by the gods. And in this story, we get her name, Pandora. Now, we move forward a little bit. When Zeus had completed the precipitous, unmanageable trap, the father sent the renowned Hermes to Epimetheus, taking the gift, swift messenger of the gods. Epimetheus gave no thought to what Prometheus had told him, never to accept a gift from Olympian Zeus, but to send it back, lest some affliction befall mortals. He accepted and had the bane before he realized it. For formerly the tribes of men on earth lived remote from ills, without harsh toil and the grievous sickness that are deadly to men. But the woman unstopped the jar and let it all out, and brought grim cares upon mankind. Only hope remained there inside in her secure dwelling, under the lip of the jar, and did not fly out, because the woman put the lid back in time by the providence of Zeus, the cloud gatherer, who bears the ages. But for the rest, countless troubles roam among men. Full of ills is the earth, and full the sea. Sicknesses visit men by day, and others by night, uninvited, bringing ill to mortals silently, because Zeus the resourceful deprived them of voice. Thus there is no way to evade the purpose of Zeus. And so in this version of the story, the punishment or the curse of the fire, which Prometheus stole from Zeus, is a bit different. In the first version, it is women. Living with a woman, living without a woman, they are all troublesome for men. That is Hesiod's argument in the first one. The second telling is that, yes, Pandora is the instrument of the downfall of mankind, but there is a shift in what happens, because it's not her in herself which is the problem here. It is rather what she introduces into the world. She opens the jar, Pandora's box, as it's famously called, and out from it flow suffering, disease, and death, disrupting this perfect, or seemingly perfect, paradise which mankind lives in, where all their needs are met by the gods automatically. Now they have to work. Now they can become ill. Now they can feel pain and go through evil events. And eventually succumb to mortality. There has been a complete shift because of what Pandora has done. But the shift isn't that we now have relations with the opposite sex, with females. The shift is, okay, now this first world, this golden age that we used to live in, has been shattered, and now we live in an age of hard toil. But as Hesiod was saying earlier, this may in fact be a good thing for men, that we need to work, that we need to be doing, because if we could get away with it, we wouldn't. So in some sense, this is a blessing. We'll come back to that later. The third major retelling of this story comes sometime later, in the 450 BC era. So we're moving forward a few hundred years here. And the figure that rewrites this story is Aeschylus, one of the great Greek tragedians. He wrote Greek tragedies, along with a figure like Sophocles, the author of Oedipus Rex. And Aeschylus writes a trilogy about Prometheus. The first part is called Prometheus Bound. And this deals with the beginning of the story that we've been discussing. And it definitely takes inspiration from Hesiod, but it kind of synthesizes and changes details here and there, which are small, but have a significant impact on the meaning of the tale. We pick up with Zeus having defeated Kronos, and he wants to annihilate humanity. Why? Well, humanity is associated with Kronos. It is his creation, and he wants to replace them with creatures which are loyal to him and perhaps even superior to us. Well, Prometheus objects to this plan. For one thing, he taught the humanity the arts, the sciences, how to understand the world, how to be imaginative, how to be creative. And this is bound up with his kind of second gift. He gives humanity the sacred fire so that they will be able to exist, that they will be able to live despite Zeus's desire to destroy them. The sacred fire protects us from Zeus's attempts to eradicate us from the earth. So as this it's associated with two functions: the survival of humanity and our artistic, creative, and scientific energies. So Zeus punishes Prometheus. He has him strapped to the rock in fetters. There is no mention of cursing humanity, or if there is no mention of Pandora or any woman being sent to punish humanity. Instead, there are suffering and toil and so on. But there's no sense of the feminine being the adversary. Later in the tale, Prometheus, we learn, has a prophecy. He knows who will bring down Zeus in the end. And he knows which woman will give birth to the son who will unseat Zeus from the throne of Olympus. And Zeus sends Hermes to threaten him. Tell us who this is, or we'll punish you. Now, Prometheus defies him. He roars against him. He refuses, outright stands against him, resolute. And so this is where Aeschylus introduces the second punishment, whereas Hesiod had the two together. Zeus has the eagle made that will feast on Prometheus's liver forevermore. So that is kind of the ending of Prometheus Bound. The two other parts, I think, either only survive in fragments or in summaries. And they tell of the kind of redemption arc and the reconciliation of Prometheus and Zeus. Eventually, Prometheus is freed by Hercules, the son of Zeus, who we were talking about earlier. And he does tell Zeus who is the threat to him. And it transpires that if Zeus marries Thetis, this woman Thetis, she will give birth to a being more powerful and wiser than Zeus, who will be able to usurp him, just as Zeus usurped his father and his father usurped his grandfather. And so Zeus has Thetis married off to a man who will eventually become the father of Achilles. And so we can see where this great character comes in terms of Achilles, this strong, powerful, lethal Achilles. What could have been if Zeus had been with this woman, I guess, is the point. And so it ends very happily. But there is this kind of interesting aspect to Prometheus Bound insofar as Zeus appears somewhat tyrannical, whereas in Hesiod, Zeus is the just lawgiver who's established the order of the world, who has overcome both his father Cronus and the monstrous beast Typhon, or Typhus, who has been a real threat to upsetting and kind of overturning the gods in humanity, replacing them with all these terrible beasts. Zeus is a hero. He is the father. He is the great king. He is glorious. His judgment is good. Whereas in Aeschylus, Zeus is clearly maniacal. He laughs at the prospect of eradicating humanity just because they're associated with Kronos. He is spiteful, he is petty, and he is driven by a lust for power and a fear of anybody opposing him, which is why he punishes Prometheus so severely and tortures him until hoping to get the answer. And this is juxtaposed with this resolute, defiant Prometheus standing against him, even though he's up against the omnipotent Zeus. Later, much later in the 19th century, Percy Shelley, one of the kind of great, well, maybe not great, but he's an influential poet of that period and author, husband, or is he the husband of Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein? He writes a play called Prometheus Unbound, which is his retelling of the second part, where, in his view, Prometheus overturns Zeus's order, or at least contributes to the overturning of it, by not revealing who Zeus should avoid marrying. Zeus eventually sleeps with Thetis, and she gives birth to the Dermagorgon, who rises up from Hades and, as this kind of powerful force, overturns the reign of Zeus, brings it crashing down. The authoritarian dictatorship, the tyranny is over, and there's, a utopia of love and happiness. It's very Enlightenment, romantic French Revolution stuff, but it's drawing on seeds or strands within Aeschylus's play which don't get fully worked out within his trilogy. It strikes you as more authentic to the first part of the trilogy, the Prometheus being defiant, rather than the rest of it. And it should be said as well, this idea of Zeus being afraid of a potential usurper is also in Hesiod, but it's not connected in this way. It's actually to do with Zeus's first wife, which, let me find her name. Metis. So Zeus's first wife is Metis, and it is believed that if she were to conceive a son, he would usurp Zeus. He'll be wiser and more powerful. And so what does Zeus do? What do you think he does? I'll give the chat a moment to say what they think Zeus does in response to this. How does he solve the problem of the possibility that Metis might conceive a son. She does conceive a daughter, Athena, and she is one of the greatest and mightiest of the gods in Zeus's reign. But it is not her. It's if she has a son after Athena. Incidentally, this is also why Athena is constantly in conflict with Hera, who is one of Zeus's other wives. Hera is intensely jealous of Athena and hates that she is Zeus's firstborn daughter or child. So throughout mythology, such as in the Iliad or the tales of Hercules, Hera is constantly at Athena's throats. Ben Wheeler has the answer: eat her. Kind of swallowed her. He doesn't chew her up or anything like that, but no, he swallows her whole. And so, dwelling in his belly, she is unable to conceive. And this is interesting because Zeus himself usurped his father Kronos, who had been swallowing his own children to stop them from overthrowing him, but he had been deceived into swallowing a stone rather than Zeus. And so Zeus had been able to grow and become more powerful enough to overthrow Kronos. So it's interesting because it's easy to see Kronos as this awful character and Zeus liberating the Olympians, but he himself does the same thing to Thetis. It's it's quite an interesting kind of dynamic here. One can't help but think of the attitudes of the elder generations to the younger in our current situation. But be that as it may. So these are kind of the main tellings of the Promethean story. And we've already hinted at some of the important themes within it, at least for our purposes. That you could spend a lifetime analyzing these. They're so rich and filled with intriguing ideas and kind of paradoxical aspects. And I think where I want to move next is kind of to talk about the importance of the sacred fire for the ancient Greeks, because the people listening to this were not like us. They don't share our way of life. They don't share how we think about the world. They don't engage with reality in the same way that we do. And so when they're listening to these stories, we have to think about, okay, what's their experience of fire? Do they have a concept of the sacred fire beyond this Promethean story? And if so, then how might that relate to this tale and inform how Hesiod's telling it or Icelus is telling it, and how that then impacts the listener? Like, how are they going to be understanding this? And it transpires that sacred fire was central to Greek religious, private, and public life. It was one of the most important things within society, not only for the Greeks, but for the Romans too. If you look at a book like The Ancient City by Galanges, it goes into great detail about this aspect. And many of the things he says in the 19th century, or is it the 20th century? Early 20th century, perhaps, when he writes this, have been confirmed by modern archaeology and history. So this isn't just some kind of niche esoteric thing. Actually, this is well established. It's the consensus view. It seems that most families within a Greek town would have in their house a hearth, a fire, and that they would treat this fire with utmost reverence and respect. They had certain codes about what kinds of wood could be used to burn. It couldn't just be anything thrown into the fire. there were rules about how this fire should be lit and with what kinds of thing. It shouldn't just be with anything. Actually, you should try to use the sun's rays or two sticks of wood together. There were certain purification rites one had to undergo to light the fire. And then throughout the year, the master and lady of the house were expected to tend the fire. They had to make sure that the fire never went out. Now, that it didn't have to necessarily be a roaring fire, but you keep the embers burning. When it came to sacrifices, the fire would be the place where you would conduct the rituals. When you had a feast, the first fruits of the feast, the main portion or the primary portion would be given to the fire. If the fire ever went out, not only was this a breaking of one's sacred duties and a cause of a great deal of shame, but it was also an omen that just as the fire goes out, so will the family be extinguished. The two were bound together. And this was reflected in the fact that the members of the household would pray to the fire. They would seek prosperity and security, a good life, happiness, all the things you could ask for, they would look to in the fire. And this domestic kind of religious practice was reflected on a citywide scale. The cities of ancient Greece would have a hearth at their center in a building called the Prytaneon. Forgive me for my pronunciation, but this would be the kind of main seat of governmental power within a city or town. And at the very heart of these buildings would be a hearth or altar, wherein there would be one of these sacred fires. Let me show you an example of this, because this is a really good one. So this is the Prytaneon at Lyra. And you can see right in the middle of the building, what do we have here? We have a hearth. And this wouldn't just be for cities. You would also find these in sacred places, temple sites, such as Olympia, where the Olympic Games were held, or at Delphi, where the Oracle of Delphi was. And at all of these places, fires were maintained. The priests who were maintaining this were not just, priests in the sense we would think of them. They were the rulers themselves. It would be the ruler and the governors and their families who were expected to maintain the fire within these towns. And the survival and flourishing of the city was thought to be bound up with the flame. If the ruler ever let the flame die, not only were they breaking their oaths, forgoing all honor and glory, but it was an omen. It was a sign that the city will die as well. So it was of vital importance to maintain the sacred fire at the heart of the community, at the heart of the city. And what is more, it seems that when ancient Greek cities established colonies, whether either by invasion or inhabiting new land, an individual would take a torch, light it with the sacred flame from the fire of the mother town, and then establish a new sacred flame in the new town. It's almost like the essence of the town is conveyed with the fire which goes with it. So the sacred fire was really important for the ancient Greeks. And there's this interesting dynamic insofar as the eldest daughter of Kronos, the eldest child, was named Hestis. And she is Zeus's oldest sibling. And her name, Hestia, means hearth or altar. And she became associated with the sacred fires, these hearths in the house and in the city. Indeed, they were called Hestias, right? So this is a really kind of interesting personification. And indeed, it was believed, or in some tales it was told, that the sacrifices conducted on any hearth were taken up by Hestia and used to maintain the hearth at the center of Mount Olympus, where the gods dwelled. In other words, our sacrifices, our fires, what we maintain contributes to maintaining the glory and splendor, the prosperity, and continuing existence of the gods on Mount Olympus. And if we should ever fail, then woe betide the gods. Perhaps this would bring them down completely. And so, and as Ragplay says, the cosmic order, we have a kind of sense in which we are participating through our maintenance of the sacred fire in our house, in our city, with the heavenly fire, which maintains the whole edifice. That sustains us. If we should break that link, the chains, then we are at risk of allowing chaotic forces like the Linernian Hydra, like typhus, like the Nemean lion, from disrupting this order which has been built by Zeus. And so Hestia is both the sacred flame, she is both the altar, and she is this goddess who unites us with Mount Olympus from our very homes, bringing the two together in a very powerful way. And what's also interesting is that Hestia and the sacred flame and the hearth was carried over into Roman civic religion. It seems that many Romans also had hearths within their homes and continued to tend to them just as the ancient Greeks did. And they saw the survival of Rome as having a similar relationship to a public sacred hearth. In particular, the one in the temple of Vesta. Vesta is the Roman equivalent of Hestia. And who tended the temple of Vesta? Well, it was the Vestal Virgins, the famous Vestal Virgins. These were women who, prior to puberty, were selected by lot from perfect virginal girls, and they would go on. Initially, two of them, moving on to 4, and then to 6. They were expected to tend the fire, one of them always being present with the fire, tidying the temple, which in a sense is cleaning or purifying the city. And the flame was held to be that which sustained Roman life. Cicero says as much, that if the fire ever goes out, that will be the end of Rome. It's almost like the energy or the engine of Rome is this flame. And what is more, the virginity of the priestesses was held to have been so vital to this enterprise because of the purity of the thing that they are maintaining. If they ever let it to the flame extinguish, they may be beaten. But if they had sex, it was as if the walls of Rome had been penetrated by an invader. That's how the Romans saw it. And so these women who were caught having sex, these Vestal Virgins, being a contradiction, as it were buried alive or entombed alive, because it was believed their blood couldn't be spilled, and they had to do it in a kind of voluntary way. It sounds very strange to us, but this was deadly serious for these people, and a few women did lose their lives because of these beliefs. What's interesting here is that we have an identification then of the king or the ruler being a pontifex, The pontifex is a word for bridge. It's what the priests were called in ancient Rome. They were a bridge between heaven and earth, between the sacred and the mundane. And they did so through tending the sacred fire. Through doing so, they mediated between the transcendent and the city. And by doing so, they sustained the flourishing of the city. By keeping this connection or communion with a higher power, they were giving life to their people. By contrast, when they failed to tend the flame, they broke the connection, which sounds too mechanical. They severed the how would you describe it? The life flow, the force or the flow from the gods, which was in rejuvenating the people, which was giving them life and prosperity. When that was removed, the wealth disappeared, death entered, and everything fragmented. So there was this sense in which the ruler and the fire were intimately tied and held as a kind of wall or pillar, the apex mundi, that was holding the whole thing together. It's and indeed this sort of notion was held in the stories these people told about the founding of their cities, that often it was some individual who found the sacred fire, who founded the first hearth, and it was they and their descendants who would go on to tend the flames. And that was indeed their right or authority to rule over the people, that they had this honor of guarding the Hestia. We see this particularly in the stories about the founding of Rome. The first stage of it seems to be this idea that Aeneas, one of the refugees from the Trojan War who escaped the siege of Troy, the sack of Troy, brought with him the sacred flame of Troy, and with his men settled in northern Italy and began this practice of, within homes, worshipping the sacred fire, tending the hearth. Later, Romulus, having killed his brother Remus and establishing the foundations of the city of Rome, what does he do? He establishes a hearth and celebrates at the heart of the city the sacred fire. And he and his descendants go on to keep on doing this. Emperors like Augustus had their own vestal hearth within their living, within the buildings they lived in, and so there was an even stronger connection or integration between the sovereign and the tales of the sacred fire, and how the survival of a people rests on the two united. So there is this really strong integration of these ideas. And so when we get to a story like Prometheus, this is the context in which people are talking about the sacred fire. And remember, in the first version, the Theogenes version, Zeus withdraws the fire which lasts forever. I'll repeat that. Zeus withdraws the fire that lasts forever, the everlasting fire. But this is precisely what the people of ancient Greece and Rome are celebrating, are reverencing, are seeking to maintain within their towns and cities and homes, in the belief that if the fire lasts forever, so will Rome, the eternal city, last forever. So will Athens and Sparta. And when it fades, we will die. And so in many ways, the gift Prometheus gave these people is their lifeblood, is that which gives them vitality. That's the importance that these ideas bring to the Prometheus story. And in turn, it brings to the practices, the Promethean story brings to the practices this very powerful sense of gratitude for the gift of fire, that this wasn't a given, that this was something which was actually going to be withdrawn from mankind. And remember too, and I think this is so vital, the whole incident begins with a sacrifice. It's the sacrifice of an animal to the gods, using the sacred fire. And Zeus then decides to withdraw that sacred fire because of the deception of Prometheus. This idea from the very beginning, this is how it's supposed to be done. This is the right way to sacrifice to the gods. And so this practice even predates the gift of Prometheus. In a way, Prometheus enables us to continue doing what we did in the Golden Age. It's perhaps the last remnant from the Golden Age of what life was like. It was sacrificing animals to the gods using the sacred fire. Perhaps this is the one glimmer of bliss within a world filled with suffering and toil and disease, following the gift of fire. I think that's very, very powerful and illuminating, or at least opens up the Promethean tale in a way that I think we don't often appreciate when we just tell it straight away, without that kind of context. And moreover, in understanding that for these people, this fire is the very lifeblood of their families, their communities, their people. If the fire dies, their people die. And so Prometheus did something very beautiful for them. But then also understanding that actually this is a kind of the use of the fire or engagement with the fire, the sacred fire, the pure fire, is a direct encounter with the mythological, the transcendent, another realm or two different spaces interacting at once, different time periods interacting at once, a punctuation of the Golden Age in our age of suffering and toil. It's in some ways, to me, it has resonances and kind of breaks out in a similar way in the Eucharist, the Christian practice of celebrating the death of Jesus Christ through the ritual use of bread and wine, which in Catholicism, these elements turn into the body and blood of Jesus Christ in the here and now. There's a kind of breaking in of the past and into the present. There's a sense of this is what nourishes us. It's the same sort of thing going on with the fire. So that's kind of the first angle I wanted to touch on this. The second is to do with Heraclitus. Now, Heraclitus was a Greek philosopher. He was a pre-Socratic philosopher. So he was before Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And so he's probably best known for a couple of phrases. I think one of them is a misquote. It wasn't actually something he said, which is that you can never step in the same river twice. He does say something similar, but it's not that. He's also known. He's also known for this idea that everything is in constant flux. And that is something that sounds like him and reads like him. He's a let me double check when exactly he was knocking about our good friend Heraclitus. While I'm looking this up, he He's a kind of enigmatic figure. The excerpts we have from him, which aren't many, it's not so much a system of philosophy. He wasn't a Plato working out the world of forms. He's not kind of thinking systematically like Aristotle. Many of his sayings are mysterious, aphoristic. They're difficult to interpret. There's a ring of wisdom and truth in them, but it's difficult to know exactly what he means. Nonetheless, he is a philosopher. He has kind of mystical, paradoxical sayings, but he does try to integrate with them general principles, an understanding of cosmology, bringing in metaphysics and so on. He is trying to relate his understanding of reality at its most fundamental level. What is reality? But he doesn't do so in a super clear way, and I think it means he's open to a lot of different interpretations, and a number of scholars have lots of different views of what he's trying to say. So that's the kind of warning or the qualification of what I'm about to try and explain about Heraclitus, because although I'll try not to be too committal to one side or another, there's going to be some things I say which maybe some scholar will argue against, and much more eloquently and erudite than I can defend my interpretation. Nonetheless, we will have a look into Heraclitus, and one of the key kind of things about Heraclitus is he seems to have been a material monist. That means he believed that the universe was composed of one material reality, and he wrote the following, which kind of sums up this idea: all things are in exchange for fire, and fire for all things, as gold is for goods and goods for gold. And this kind of sums up his idea that all things are made or constitute ever living fire. Everything, including the earth, sea, air, they are all turnings of fire. Turnings being kindling and quenching. So we can kind of see it again. He says, God, day, night, winter, summer, war, peace, plenty, famine. But it becomes of another kind, as fire, when it is mingled with incense, is named according to the savor of each. So in this kind of last phrase here, what he's saying is like, we often differentiate things according to their differences. So, or rather, we label things according to their differences to other things. So we talk about day versus night. We talk about winter versus summer, plenty versus famine, war versus peace. We're contrasting opposites here. So war, a stage of violence between two peoples or nations, contrasting with peace when two nations or peoples are not at war. Plenty versus famine, a time of abundant food versus a time of very little food. The day, 12 hours of sunlight, let's say, contrasted with night, where 12 hours without sunlight with the moon and stars. So we're looking at the opposites here. But he's trying to say, well, this isn't quite right. Although, okay, these things are opposite, but they are changes in a continuous reality, in a coherent reality. And we are just drawing out the distinctions or the opposites, but in fact, there is something which unites these things, which can go from day to night, which can go from winter to summer, from war to peace and back to war. There is something which unites within the opposites. And that for him, he characterizes as fire, or in this phrase, God. There seems to be a merging of the two together here. Now, a figure like Jonathan Baldwin will characterize or say what Heraclitus meant by fire was something like energy, what we would call energy today, that it's constantly changing, that it is becoming and destroying, that it is creating and ending. And we see this in the nature of fire. It's constantly moving, its form is very fluid, it's almost liquid-like in some ways. You cannot kind of fix it in one place. It is, very creative. Through it we can produce wonderful things. We can smelt metal and turn it into various shapes, such as a blade or a beautiful brooch. We can use it to heat meat. We can use it to warm ourselves. We can use it to produce light. And indeed today, following the Industrial Revolution, we have an even greater use of fire, perhaps, or more varied use of fire. We can use it to power our cars, to produce electricity by burning coal, oil, and gas. And from there, the number of things we've produced using that power is incredible. Fire is the engine of the modern world, just as it was of the ancient world. But at the same time, how do we do that? Well, I've just mentioned the fire has to burn the coal. It's destroying, it's consuming, it's devouring a material to produce an effect which is beneficial to us. So it contains within itself these opposites and this dynamic, fluctuating reality of potentials, on kind of contradictory potentials. And this characterizes for Heraclitus the nature of reality as being one of opposites in unity. Opposites in unity. We've already touched on a couple with fire, but he uses, so one example would be a road can both be high and low. A road can be both high and low. Let me get up a few more. It is uphill and downhill, one and the same. Beginning is together with end on a circle. Into rivers, the same ones, on those who step in, different and different waters flow. Physicians cut and burn people and ask for a fee on top of that. Donkeys would choose garbage rather than gold. There is in these kind of statements both a kind of folky wisdom, but more than that, he's saying that actually things contain within themselves seeming contradictions or opposites. And one author suggests this in terms of potentialities, or in certain respects. So he has a really good one with seawater. This is a good illustration from Heraclitus. Sea, purest and most polluted water, for fish drinkable and life-sustaining, for people undrinkable and death-bringing. Now, the point of these comments is, well, seawater in itself is neither pure nor polluted, right? Although he's not talking in a modern sense of pollution. It has the potential to be both beneficial and harmful. It's the potential to be beneficial for a fish who can swim and live in seawater. Without that seawater, it would die. So it is beneficial to the fish. But for the human, seawater is lethal if it is drunk, and we cannot live within it. We would drown eventually if we were, floating out at sea trying to survive. So the seawater has opposites contained within itself, we might say, depending on the situation. And for Heraclitus, this is true of all reality. We contain potentials which are opposites, which are good and bad depending on the circumstance. And we can think about that in many different examples of this. But this is true for all things. And as we saw, fire has this both creative and destructive element. Hence the identification of fire as that which runs through all reality, which all things are a fluctuation of, a process of changing, which is both destructive and creative. But more than that, he wants to say that there is in a sense a conflict within reality, that there is a real struggle of things, of strife. And there's a very good kind of summary of this view by Aristotle, writing on Hesiod. Aristotle says the following: Heraclitus rebukes Homer the poet, who said, "Would that strife might perish from among gods and men, for there would be no fitted structure, i.e., harmony, if there were no high-pitched and low-pitched, nor would there be animals without the opposites male and female." Again, this is what Heraclitus writes: "War is father of all, king of all. Some it shows as gods, some as human, some it makes slaves, and some free." Heraclitus is essentially saying that opposites are necessary in reality for there to be both flourishing and beauty. In the case of humanity, if we were all men, as Hesiod seems to have wished for, well, yes, that may be great in some ways, but we would not be able to reproduce and have the continuation of the human race after this point. In terms of beauty, well, in some ways, Heraclitus sounds a lot like John Ruskin on this point. It actually requires a differentiation of notes to produce harmony. And if we were following Ruskin, we could go even further. For Ruskin, beauty lies in the appropriate amount of variation. You can't just have the same tune played over and over. At certain points, the monotony needs to be broken up by a change, either by adding to the original tune new instruments or harmonies, or with a new theme being introduced completely, a completely different kind of melody coming into play. And what is more, and this is I think Ruskin mentions this. Schopenhauer definitely talks about it too. You need discord. You can't just have notes which are all harmonious. You actually need discordant notes, notes which clash with those that have gone before, to develop an intriguing melody, a beautiful melody. And indeed, somebody like Wagner pushes this to the absolute limit, where in Tristan and Isolde, one of the great operas, probably one of the greatest works of art of all time, he writes a piece which, for almost the entire opera, is one discord after another. It's absolutely amazing what he achieves, because what he does is he starts the opera with a chord, the famous Tristan's chord, with two discords in it. It then moves to a second chord which resolves one of the dissonances but not the other, and that's how it moves on throughout the whole opera until the end. And this is to reflect the tensions we feel in romantic longing and desire, which are only finally resolved, only finally laid to rest in death. A cheery wee opera, of course. And so Heraclitus, we could see, as saying something similar, that actually, if you want to have creativity and beauty and all of the magnificence and majesty, the variation in reality, you can't just have a uniform, homogeneous, monistic thing. You actually need to have space for opposites, for conflict, for push and pull, both in terms of fundamental categories and in terms of the realities which exist within the world. There's a philosopher called John McMurray, a Scottish philosopher. He's not very well known, but he gave a series of lectures, actually as part of the Gifford Lectures, which are a very prestigious kind of philosophy of religion lecture series. A figure like William James gave them at one point. And the thing about, one of the ideas that McMurray has is that modern people, following Descartes, we emphasize sight far too much. We conceptualize the world according to vision. And this allows for the possibility of imagining that this is a simulation, that what we see is in fact an illusion, in part because we know that appearances can deceive, but also because of there's a kind of passiveness as an observer. It's something that we receive into us, these sights from the world. We are a neutral observer, or at least that's the kind of perception we might have. Whereas the primary sense for McMurray is touch. Touch is how we really engage with reality. And when you think about it, it makes sense. To do anything, you have to touch it. If you want to change something, if you want to, say, comb your hair, you have to touch your hair. If I want to write something in the chat like right now, let me write hello. I had to touch my keyboard to do that. If I want to if I want to move something, I have to push it, right? I have to pick it up or pull it, or so on and so forth. If I'm making a work of art, I can't just look at it. I have to pick up my tools, pick up my paintbrush, and I have to engage with a canvas, with a block of marble, and chisel away at it. It's all tactile. And I mean, one of the things McMurray says is, if you're touching something, if you're engaging with it, if you're acting upon it in this way, it's almost impossible to really conceive of it being a simulation. It's only when you're thinking of it in terms of vision that you can entertain such a possibility. But the other point he makes is that all of these touches, all of these tactile interactions, these activities, they involve resistance. Everything which touches each other is in resistance to one another. They're fighting against each other in a way. Indeed, if we didn't, we wouldn't be able to do anything. It's because this chair resists me, is pushing against my body, that it is able to hold me up at the moment. If it didn't have any resistance, I would fall through the floor. If the poles on a bridge, when they're shaped like that, they're actually pushing against each other. But it's because they're pushing against each other that they actually stay up. It is the resistance that's going on, which is actually, allowing for that structure to exist. And that could be true also. Let's take the block of marble. It's because it doesn't just, when the chisel goes into it, both forces are kind of, there's almost a kind of violence being acted out on that stone. It is very brutal, hacking away at it at certain points. And because the stone is able to resist it to a certain degree, this allows for the shaping of it. Whereas if the chisel went straight through, you wouldn't be able to do much art at all. So resistance or conflict is, even in these basic things, taking place, but is precisely the foundation upon which all of these activities, which bring so much color to life, are possible. And so I think that's kind of where Heraclitus is going with that. And I mean, there's dangers of equivocation, but at a certain point, I'm of the position, well, I'm quite happy to make these sorts of jumps and leaps because they're intriguing possibilities. Because here we're talking about metaphysical and physical resistance, right? and how it's a basis for reality. And so why fire, which is a dangerous thing, which is something which has an an intrinsically kind of how would you say? I would say fire has a sort of combative energy or vitality insofar as it is so destructive and dangerous and painful, right? To touch it hurts you, but it is so life-giving as well, that this is a good either symbol or as a literal kind of characterization of the essence of reality for Heraclitus. But this also then applies to our lives. And this is what I think Hesiod in Works and Days was kind of getting at, that actually we need conflict as individuals, as peoples, as civilizations, if we're going to strive, if we're going to flourish. Those of us who don't have challenges in life end up stunted, end up without being able to grow and achieve virtues. We become, without challenges, there is no need to invent. There is no need to think through plans, to act in the world. The golden age of mankind, where all their needs are met, they're essentially infants, perpetual infants suckling at the teat of Zeus, we might say. They are babies. They are unable to produce anything of value. But it is those men who toil, who suffer, who have hardship, who are able to grow in mental, moral, and physical strength. That doesn't mean they will, but it is the engine by which they can. And I mean, this is one of the driving points of my speech to come at the Witten. We have this conception that a comfortable life is the ideal. And in many ways, I can understand it. It certainly appeals to us on a very, in a very powerful way, especially given the conditions of modern working life. But in reality, if we could achieve that, whether it be through futurist technological means or by establishing a shire, a kind of tradcon shire, it wouldn't be good. It would be degenerative. It would destroy us. It would take us backwards, and in many ways, it kind of has already. We, in the kind of grand scheme of history, many of us have lived a life of luxury by comparison to our forebears who had to struggle for heat, food, shelter. Even those who had stability in these things had to strive a lot more, had to put in a lot more effort. Take like the peasant farmer of medieval England. They didn't lead a bad life. They weren't serfs. They weren't slaves. They didn't. They had a reasonable level of comfort, but they had to work hard at their craft, whether that be farming or metalwork, wood cutting, and so on. Their homes were okay in terms of warmth, but they couldn't just flick a switch and turn on the central heating. Their food was dependent on seasonal cycles, famine not hitting. By contrast, okay, there is some fluctuation in prices, but generally speaking, our supermarkets are still pretty full for decades now. And if one product goes off, well, there's hundreds more to pick from. We are the most comfortable people who have ever lived, and yet our abilities, never mind our morals, our abilities, our practical abilities are not what they were. the general IQ is going down, and I don't just think that's because of you know, immigration from the third world, where IQs tend to be lower than Europe's. I think it's also because the general population's IQ is going down, and no wonder. We don't have to think through for most of our lives. We don't have to think to get by. We don't have to consider what we're doing to survive. That's somebody else's problem. But then, of course, that leads on to the competency crisis, because when you've got people who are less skilled, less thoughtful, who are weaker than those who set up those systems in the first place, those who were capable of developing those systems, well, no wonder they fall into decline and decay. So it's the removal of conflict, which is actually a goal of our society, which is, that's the other thing. Our society, whether it be the government, corporations, they all sell us this dream of a peaceable, comfortable life, freed from all suffering and toil. And they actively seek to eradicate any form of pain or displeasure. And this can be particularly seen around things like removing offense or any form of anxiety. It's a terrible thing to make somebody feel guilty. Well, I would say actually no, it's good to feel guilt if you've done something wrong. But we live in such a society where, oh no, we can't feel something like guilt because that's a harmful thing. That's a painful thing, and we don't want that. No, we need a comfortable life. So we are comfortable. We idealize comfort. It's not good for us. Not at the levels we have it. And this, to me, Heraclitian, I don't know how you say it, that it strikes me as far more true and touches on something quite important about human beings, that we need to struggle. We need to be engaged in the cosmic struggle. And indeed, this writer, what was his name? I cannot see it at the moment. I think it was. I'll find it shortly. This writer, who summarizes Heraclitus' views, says the following: "Here, if anywhere, we seem to glimpse where Heraclitus located the meaning of life for the individual, in participation in the inner and the cosmic struggle." And I mean, in brief, that is what I will be arguing at the Witten. I've kind of gone beyond where I thought I would be. I couldn't help myself. That was Edward Hussey, writing in the Cambridge Companion to Early Greek Philosophy. So to bring that back to Prometheus, which is, there's different, there's different interpretations, different ways of examining Prometheus, different tellings of the stories. And there's these paradoxical elements of the fire as a gift, but the curse of suffering and death, the apparent benevolence or tyranny of Zeus, whether Prometheus is a helper of mankind or a trickster who betrayed the gods. I want to offer a different interpretation, or maybe one that ties into some of the thoughts within the stories, but draws more on what we've just been talking about. And in a sense, I want to say that the gift of fire necessarily comes with the gift of suffering. The gift of fire had to come with the gift of suffering. Indeed, perhaps the gift of suffering is within the gift of fire, in the kind of holding of the opposites within the whole. Because it is only the need, it is only the presentation of a challenge which moves us to try and overcome, which moves us to seek the struggle, to try and fight. to find triumph. And so Prometheus broke the infantile golden age, which had us like babies. And by giving us struggle and fire, or perhaps the two are the same thing, by giving us the struggle/fire, he gave us the ability to become most truly human, to grow up, to become, to realize ourselves as creative beings. So, I mean, I'd be interested to see what you say about that, because I realize I'm not following Hesiod in that regard, although I think in Work and Days it would be much closer to that. I'm kind of moving away from the notion that suffering is an intrinsic curse, that it is that we could have the fire without it, and saying no, actually we need the challenge, we need the strife to make life worth living. And I mean, Oswulf, I think, sums it up for me. Without the gift of fire, we would never reach our true potential. And I've seen Ragplays mention Tolkien's works a few times in here, and I don't want to go into that today. We've spoken about these ideas elsewhere on the channel and on Apostolic Majesty's channels, but you're dead right to bring him up. Tolkien shared this conviction that the evils of Melkor in Middle-earth were an instrument used by Eru to bring about a better world than the initial paradise. And without that suffering, there would be something missing from reality, something worthwhile. And indeed, that's also a Christian view, or at least one theological view within Christianity, that the fall of Adam and Eve paved the way for a better world, one that could be redeemed by Christ, one that would allow us to grow as souls towards love of God in a meaningful sense, and not just one of infantile happiness. So that's kind of my presentation on Prometheus. I'll give folks a few minutes to write any comments or questions they want to make, and then we'll go through some of them. As I was saying at the beginning of the stream, next week, Shieldings is hosting the Witten, and this whole stream was inspired by that, insofar as I want to talk about some of these themes, such as struggle and so on, but I don't have the space within my my talk to talk about Prometheus. Although part of me is thinking maybe I should just go over this and write it down and just do this, because it works quite well. But yes, so I thought I would talk about Prometheus today, get it out of my system, share it with you guys, because I think the Promethean myth is one of the most important, and I hope this has done some justice to the story and has made you to think about it a bit, and what it means, perhaps in a way which is often missed, and also how the notion of sacred fire was integral to Greek religion and thought. And I mean, I can see how somebody like Heraclitus would come up with the idea that the world is, everything is kind of an extension of fire. Is essentially fire, given the practices of the ancient Greeks with tending the sacred fire and believing that it was eternal. I can definitely see that view, although in saying that, other philosophers before him had located the fundamental realities being air or water or earth. So he's just following that pattern as well. But it certainly ties in with a more popular view, even though the others couldn't articulate that. as he did. So let's have a quick look at some of the comments. If there's any super chats, they will get priority. But otherwise, let's see. Caravaggio. It would be great if you could build a bonfire for this at the Witten Wall. Yeah, maybe I should just have a bonfire on stage and invite everybody round to sit around it and tend it. And we should all, we're not allowed to let it die during the whole Witten. Somebody has to be tending it at some point. If we have any Vestal virgins in the Witten, we shall get them to do it. Although, I mean, we don't have many women going, right? So, although it might be different this year. So, but if there's only a few of them, the load might be they might be carrying the load. So let's see. I will say though that I'm not going to be talking about the sacred fire, but I will be talking about something else which was really important during ancient Greece. Indeed, it was one of the major religious festivals of ancient Greece. I shall give you a clue to what I will be discussing with my the title of my talk: A Lesson from Olympia on Why Man Needs to Struggle. Read into that what you will, my friends. Oh, my eye. I've got some bad hay fever tonight. Oh, Call of the Shield Maiden. It says, burn me at the stake. Well, no, you will be tending the fire at the Witten. Call of the Shield Maiden. You won't be on the fire. I hope not, at least. I should say as well, if you don't know, Call of the Shield Maiden, she is doing fantastic, wonderful work producing the Corncrake magazine, which is absolutely wonderful. And I'm not just saying that because I have some stories published in it. She has brought together many different writers, both past and present, and to kind of reintroduce us to English literature. And it's been running for about 6 months now, and there's going to be a special edition, a physical edition for the Witten. But beyond that, it's just worth checking out. I really love it. It's one of the true white pills at the moment. Something that gives me a lot of hope and encouragement. So I would thoroughly recommend that you go away and have a look at the Corncrake. And I should say as well, my story Darklands. You may notice some Promethean motifs emerging within that if you get the chance to read it. So, yes, let's see what else. So, David, not sure whether Prometheus's actions basically took away using sacrifice as acknowledgement of what is given to us from nature, with a lifestyle that requires constant maintenance and refueling. I mean, that's certainly, a possible way to think about it, that it removes the gratitude we might have towards the gods if they're supplying all our needs, and now that we have to toil and so on. Although it should be said again that, or not again, sorry, it should be said that the ancient Greeks still thought that the weather cycles, for example, were controlled by the movements of various deities and so on. So there would still be a connection between the sacred and so on, and their lives. Moreover, they did pray to the sacred fire for prosperous life and for food and shelter and survival and for good fortune in every endeavor. So they did see the fire as that thing which could give them a good life, as a protective force. Hestia was a protective mother figure, despite being virginal. So I think there's still some of it there, but it gets located in the fire, as it were. This could also, though, play into ideas. There was a philosopher, what's his name? Nasser, I think his name is. King Charles mentioned him once in a talk of all things on kind of esoteric traditionalism. Said Hossein Nasser, and he contrasts the pontifical man with the Promethean man. So he would have a very different view of Prometheus than I've been advocating for. He thinks pontifical man, well, we already mentioned pontifex. Pontifical man is like a bridge between God and the world, the sacred and the human. They are truly grounded in the fact that their whole life begins with, ends with, and is through the divine. And so they live in accordance to the order established by God. Whereas Promethean man, modern man, has no awareness of this. He just lives his life in a kind of empty vacuum and seeks to take control of it, almost take godhood for himself. You could read the Prometheus story as saying, well, okay, Prometheus takes the divine fire. Men try to live according to their own, possession of this sacred fire, but it's hopeless because it ends up with suffering and toil, whereas they could have had the bliss of a life following the divine order established by Zeus. And I can see how you can read it in that way. I don't think it's an illegitimate reading. I have difficulty with the idea, though, that I think it works if you abstract from the literal sense of bliss and peace which comes in the Golden Age. If it's just being centered on the divine as you encounter the challenges of life, then Nasser might have a good analogy here. But of course, you're also having to ignore the character of Zeus in that interpretation. I don't think Nasser would be particularly fond of Jupiter or Zeus, as Hesiod and Aeschylus present him. So it depends how closely you want to read the story and how you want to tie the different threads together. I think. Let's see. Rag plays sacrifice itself is a sort of constant maintenance. Yes, I think that's true. It's a recurring cycle, a recurring drama, which it can't just, except for Christ's sacrifice, which is once and for all other kinds of sacrifices would have to be perpetual. And that's why his, in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, is seen as the far superior than the old system of sacrifices. Let's see. Keeping a fire burning seems relatively easy compared to raising an animal or hunting one that would satisfy a god's desires. I mean, that is true. It's maybe a low bar in terms of the effort required. Everybody can participate, right? It's a religion which allows every household to take part, whereas not everybody's going to have the skill to hunt a deer or something like that. Which is interesting when you compare it to some of the other things the ancient Greeks saw as forms of worship. I don't want to say any more than that because that's the content of my Witten talk. But it's by far a more elitist endeavor than this one. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. The democratization of worship. Well, I mean, it's something which everybody has a stake in. The Vestal virgins tending the fire, the sacred fire of Vesta. This was seen to belong to all Romans, and indeed, this temple was open to all Roman citizens. Okay, others who were not part of the people weren't allowed to attend. So that's an important point I didn't make. The Greeks and Romans kept their household fires private, the household sacrifices private, and they wouldn't allow others from other, people who were non-citizens to see the maintenance or sacrifices, or I think even to see the sacred flame of their people. But nonetheless, like the flame of Vesta was for all the Romans, and so they had a stake in it, regardless of whether they were high or low, virtuous or mean-spirited. So yes, it had a universal quality, which when you reach something like the Olympic flame, which all humanity are united by in the Olympic ceremony today, or something to that effect, if you believed how they characterize it, then yes, it has that kind of unifying point, which I guess makes sense when you think of a hearth. Sitting around a hearth, everybody gathers towards the warmth and the light in the cold, dark winters. It makes sense as an idea. So yeah, I think there may be something in that. Nonetheless, I think it's symbolism too of the creative and destructive powers of fire are important. That it is raw power. It is vital and vibrant, which is something that shouldn't be ignored with that either. It wasn't just picked because it was easy. And I know that's not what you're saying, Rag Plays, but I think that's, you can't ignore that aspect of it. But as Oswald says, no, not all Romans could tend the fire. They could tend the fires in their own homes, but this was a fire that only the Vestal virgins tended. But any Roman could go and see it and watch the rituals. That's the point. Whereas in other temples, not everybody was allowed in. Caravaggio, keep the flame burning as a constant and never-ending endeavor. I mean, it is, and you can never give up on that. And perhaps the sign of, maybe it's a self-fulfilling thing. Those who are willing to let it slide are also the kinds of people who are going to let their civilization slide. They're going to let other things fall by the wayside because they're not concerned. If they're not concerned to uphold the most sacred and important of duties, they're not going to be worried about other responsibilities either, are they? And so, in a way, you can see that with this practice, perhaps of individuals and of whole ruling classes. You kind of see this with the broken windows theory of crime. So this is the idea that in a neighborhood, if you allow broken windows to go unrepaired and unfixed on a street, very soon you'll start to see an escalation in behaviors, and then, or maybe we start getting graffiti, and if that's not cleaned up, you get rubbish on the floor, and the dirtier and murkier it gets, you start to see more crime coming into the place. Maybe small at first, but eventually, more serious forms of crime. And this kind of slippery slope begins because there's a kind of psychological effect upon everyone that lives in that area. They see, the people in charge, they're not worried about that. They don't keep the order here. And so you can keep chipping away at it unconsciously. It's not like people are thinking, oh, look, nobody's here anymore. They just see it. They see the disorder. And it begins to flower and flourish. It's a demonstrated phenomenon, and it's something which I think demonstrates this point very well. That even if we don't see a metaphysical link between the fire and the maintenance of a people, those who are willing to let the fire die are kind of committing that broken windows situation, where, okay, that's gone, something next is going to happen too. I definitely can see that in terms of their people. David, maybe I mean use of fire is something like the mastered tool that lifted us above an animal existence. I would fundamentally agree with that. I think the way of comfort to me is an animal existence. That's what animals actually want. And like their whole life is driven by pure instinct, and that's an instinctual response to a situation. Whereas fire, suffering, creative energies that come in response to that hardship, they allow us to transcend uh, our instincts and produce things which are far superior technologically, artistically, spiritually, in terms of organization, language, so on. It all stems from that root. Both literally in terms of what fire provided humans, but also figuratively in terms of that struggle, that conflict, which leads us to excel beyond ourselves and doesn't in other creatures. So I agree with you. And you've gone on to say also the importance of control of fire, and I think that's a good point as well. It's not just unfettered fire. It's not just fire dominating the whole of reality. It's actually a form of fire which is harnessed. It's tamed is the wrong word. I don't think you can tame fire, but it is directed in a way which is congruent with human need. The two are cooperating, they're synergistic. They are an extension of one another, just as the king who tends the hearth is in a sense a manifestation or bringing into being the realm of the gods in the realm of men and women. I'll give it a little bit longer. We're getting towards 2 hours and 10 minutes, 2 hours and 15 soon. So if there's any further comments or things I've missed you want me to talk about, please do. I just want to note perhaps a couple of areas of overlap while we're waiting. Not direct overlap, but could appear so. I would say a game like Dark Souls is very clearly influenced by these ideas of sacred fire being, sustaining a people or civilization. In that case, this flame, the great flame, which what's the antagonist name called? The Gwyn, Lord of Fire, right? Lord of Cinder, sorry. You can tell I've not played Dark Souls in a while. Gwyn finds the flame, the first flame, and with its power establishes the age of fire and his reign over the world. But as the fire fades, his power fades. The fire is about to be extinguished. He sacrifices himself to keep the fire going. But the world never quite reaches back to its glory days. It's actually upset the natural balance, you might say. And the game, it's interesting because Dark Souls, it kind of includes this idea, but with contradictory ideas at the same time, which make it narratively very intriguing and spacious. But essentially, you're told from the beginning, oh, you've got to go and rekindle this fire to restore the world. Well, that sounds a lot like something a Greek or Roman individual would believe about their own sacred fires. Of course, in Dark Souls, the question is open whether this is a good order to keep going, whether you can even restore the world. And that's kind of playing on Buddhist ideas of the nature of desire and the perpetuation of suffering through extending the world, and actually accepting death or kind of embracing the end is the only way to escape this perpetual cycle of samsara and dukkha and all that kind of stuff. So, and which is, to me, I've always thought, or not always, but I've come to think that the Buddhist Schopenhauerian philosophy of denial and seeing the struggle as an enemy to escape, the individual as an illusion which must be eradicated for true peace, whilst having truth is antithetical to a Western mindset. We actually, like the Greeks and Romans, and I would say the Saxons, the Norse, the Normans, the consequent English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish peoples, the Arthurians, and so on. It's completely contradicts this philosophy. We don't want an escape from the struggle. We want to embrace it, as we see in Heraclitus. So as we see in Hercules and Beowulf and so on. There's probably a long discussion to be had about that kind of thing. This isn't the place for it, but to me, that's like a fundamental fault line in civilizations. I don't know if other civilizations embrace this kind of inner and cosmic struggle in the way that we Greeks and Trojans do. I genuinely don't know. I think some may. I'm inclined to think like Japanese traditional culture probably has a strong element of this, but I couldn't say with any confidence. But it's there in ours, and it's something which, well, it's been eroded. People have tried to replace it with this ideal of comfort, and I wouldn't say it's a spirit which is native to European peoples. Melon. Why are foreign studios seemingly more in touch with these Western themes than people in the West now? Is it because they are looking in from the outside? So this is in talking about how From Software, who developed Dark Souls, the Dark Souls trilogy, Elden Ring, they are a Japanese studio, game studio. And so they've picked up on this idea. And it seems like in a lot of Western games today, there's a rejection of traditional mythology. There's a rejection of these ideas and concepts and motifs for more progressive, sometimes we might say woke, storylines which seek to undermine these sorts of notions, or I'm even working on that level. It's a good question. I mean, I think you can't underestimate the creator of Dark Souls. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. This seems to be me this whole night, isn't it? Just double checking names for things. Dark Souls. Hidetaka Miyazaki. He was raised reading a lot of English fantasy literature and medieval stories and mythology and so on, and supplemented by also Japanese stories. And so he had a great love for these things and brings them together in a very unique blend. He's also informed by a lot of comics, graphic novels, such as Berserk, which is in itself influenced by European stories, such as Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melniboné, and other such tales. So there are kind of streams going into these individuals who are involved in developing these series. But I think you're right that they're, it'd be very weird very almost impossible to see something like this made here. Perhaps it's an aspect of looking in. It's also to do with the funding, who gets the funding, and that depends on the preferences of those who have the money, right? And what kinds of things they're prioritizing, what kinds of games they want to make, and for what reasons. But there's also, I wonder if as well, there's a kind of, with postmodernity, a cynical strain, which means that a lot of us would struggle to develop a game which felt authentic, that's inspired by mythology and medieval and other things, right? It would feel a bit LARPy to us. And I don't know if that's the case for a person from Japan, where it doesn't seem from the outside like there's been such a divorce from their tradition in all aspects of life as there has been for us. I know that there are tensions. I know that there are have been modernity's done very weird things in a place like Japan. And I think the games actually comment on some of these things, especially to do with Gwyn's children. The pressures of children living up to their fathers. But I don't. It seems to me that there is more openness in their culture, to their tradition, than there is in ours. So I wonder if that's part of it as well as all the other things. Good question. Okay, we've got a few more comments here. I'll see what I can do, and then we'll wrap up. So, Caravaggio, is it me, or have we become very anti-fire in society? I can't remember the last time I was around the campfire. I think you're right. I think there's a lot of safety laws to do with that. You can also see the kind of environmental movement as being anti-fire because of the smoke that it releases into the atmosphere, the movement away from certain resources, burning resources to renewable energy is part of this. You can see it also with the abolition of smoking, or attempts to abolish smoking, right? Smoking involves flames. We don't have that as much. It's the safety thing, though. I think first and foremost, flames are dangerous, and trying to remove them as far as possible is going to be a part of a safety-driven culture. I guess also as well, you mentioned a campfire. That works when you've got people to go camping with, or families and so on. But a lot of people don't do that now, or that kind of thing. So that kind of removes the need for the campfire. It's kind of sad, really. Yeah, I think it's a good point. David, too many soft furnishings. Totally agree. Need to return to the bare bedroom, I suppose. Rag plays. It's because people no longer even understand fire, what it does, what it can do. I family fear it in the sense that it might cause a brush fire or other such nonsense. Well, that's true as well. And I mean, if you've never been taught and you've been told all these dangerous things about fire, and no doubt it can be very dangerous, but if you've never then been taught how to handle it properly, then you are going to be pretty scared of it and unable to deal with it. People also fear it because of the ridiculous web of ordinances on where one can have a fire and where it's legal. Well, and that's also part of it, right? The regulations around it make it almost too much hassle. It's here in piano too. Northern Ireland on the 12th of July is one situation where fire is held to a high regard. Well, let's. Oh yes, I think I've seen images of this. Bonfires. Can we get a good picture here? Oh yes, I don't think I can really show these pictures because they're kind of sectarian. But setting fire to these massive wooden towers. Go and search it in your own time, guys. It's interesting to look at. So bubble wrap society, insurance culture, fire requires respect. Quite right. Fire requires respect and reverence, as the ancients did before us. So, thank you guys for watching. I'm really actually quite grateful for how much engagement you've given to this topic, and I'd love it if we continue this conversation in the comments, or elsewhere on Twitter or whatnot. It'd be really good to talk further about this, because this is something that I think, you know, you can analyze things and you can spend your time, discussing texts, myths, and so on, and you get good things from it. And it has value, and yet you can feel, oh, was that surface level, or was that something which will only stay in the brain but not affect the heart? And I hope it does. But this is one where I think, for me, in my own kind of studies, it has impacted me, and it has made me rethink my life, what I'm doing. And because I think it gets to some fundamental points, and we shouldn't be surprised. There's a reason why the Promethean myth has been passed down for thousands of years, and why fire and the idea of the sacred fire still is with us in the Olympic ceremony, even though we live in a secular age. There's something about it which captures our imagination, which speaks to us in a way that goes beyond our modern minds, our modern liberal minds, and touches something very deep, dark, and powerful. Oh, I see we have a couple of, a super chat, and then a couple of comments. So this is from Holy Weather for $7.99. Dollars. I think that's Australian dollars. It's often illegal to light campfires here due to protection of native timber. Yeah, so you're right that it's not just about the danger the fire might cause, but also protecting the environment, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Actually, it's good to protect trees, right? It's just when it becomes such an extent where you can't have any fires, or it becomes only in a very limited space where you can have a fire, unless we're not used to engaging with them in the way our ancestors did. But that's very interesting. Especially in a hot country like Australia, I can see where that kind of thing would happen, where it's more difficult to imagine in Britain. The bushfires raging and so on. And so thank you very much for your super chat. That is very kind of you, and I do appreciate it. And on that note, thank you everybody. Everybody who watched, I'm grateful. Thank you to everyone who's been commenting in the chat, and please do like, comment, subscribe, etc. I probably won't be back for a week or so, as I'll be speaking at the Witten next week. Perhaps afterwards, I'll have to do a stream reviewing the Witten, or discussing the Witten with some of the folks who may have gone to the Witten. That could be quite fun, and maybe give you a little bit of a taster of what of what took place. But in the meantime, God bless you all, whoever you are, wherever you are. Good night.